May I just say that if I were to even attempt the thank yous that I owe to the people in this room, the time allotted me would absolutely not suffice. I have so much to be thankful for, to my husband, my family, my editor, my friends, and all of you being here, that the Tikva Fund should have been set up, I always think of as being done for my sake almost, because I have found this so amazingly important in my life. And I don't know whether we should take for granted a gathering like this, the opportunity that this provides us to think about the things that we think about in private, but now can withdraw for a few hours from American politics to think about here in this cozier and safer zone. So my topic, Comfort in a Time of Crisis, is really to the point. At the previous gathering for the Jewish Review of Books, I spoke about how Jewish magazines gave Jews a language and a platform for thinking about their problems. And one of the examples that I brought was from Sholem Aleichem, the best-known Yiddish writer of his time. Today, our situation seems, if anything, even more troubling than it did last October. In fact, in my mind at least, America is for the first time edging out Israel in the anxiety market. And around me, I find some very good people slipping into near despair. So I would turn again to Sholem Aleichem, as Jews once did in even greater times of crisis than ours. So first, Sholem Aleichem died a century ago in May of 1916. And just as we mark the Yortzeit of cherished relatives, it seems appropriate to mark the anniversary of the death of this beloved author. In 1883, the young Sholem Rabinovich adopted for his pen name the phrase of greeting that Jews extend to one another when they meet in the street, Sholem Aleichem. His name was Sholem Rabinovich. He made a joke of it, and he called himself Sholem Aleichem. So with this approachable, welcoming pen name, he put his fellow Jews at ease, making no distinction among them in education or status. The response to him was unprecedented. The Zionist pamphlets that he wrote outsold those of Theodor Herzl. His stories were snapped up by Yiddish newspapers of all the political parties of the time. By the time he died, as had happened by that time here in New York, the estimated 100,000 people thronging the streets for his funeral made it the largest such tribute the city had ever seen. So if Jews are in any sense a cultured people, we should know a little bit about this towering literary figure and revisit him from time to time. Another reason for paying attention to Sholem Aleichem, as you so kindly said, is his ongoing importance in America. Through the American musical Fiddler on the Roof that adapted Sholem Aleichem for the stage, he became the best known of all Yiddish writers, I think eclipsing even Nobel Prize-winning Isaac Bashevis Singer, who had tried very hard to overtake him. Tevye became a Broadway hero, a Hollywood hero, and a star of the international stage. Someone just told me recently that a great tenor concludes his classical concert with a rendition of If I Were a Rich Man. And we know that kids in Japan sing Sunrise, Sunset in their elementary school productions. And Jeremy Dauber of Columbia University, who's just written a very fine biography of Sholem Aleichem, introduces his author as the man who created Tevye. He writes, if you are an American of a certain generation span, there is no talking about Sholem Aleichem without talking about Fiddler on the Roof. Forget Sholem Aleichem. There's no talking about Yiddish, his language or art, without talking about Fiddler on the Roof. There's no talking about Jews without talking about Fiddler. So here is a writer who gave the world its iconic representation of the Jews. And judging from the audience around me at that matinee of Fiddler to which I was just privileged to attend, even New Yorkers even Jewish New Yorkers now get to know about their Jewishness from this musical. And then perhaps the most important reason for turning to Sholem Aleichem is for the same reason that his audience always did, and that is for good entertainment, for the humor that invites us, as my brother David Roskies put it, to laugh off the trauma of history, and, as my title suggests, for comfort in a time of crisis. There are writers who try to shake us out of our complacency with apocalyptic scenarios. There are writers who want to represent actuality, reality, our society as they think it really is. Sholem Aleichem said he wanted to comfort his people. Now that we are in a time of crisis, even if not as critical as the one that engulfed the Jews of Russia in his time, we too look for that in a time of crisis. But what does it mean? Is it a placebo? Is it for some kind of hope? Are we looking for reassurance? And if so, what kind of reassurance? What is supposed to reassure us? And here we run into an interesting problem. The tevye of Fiddler on the Roof is not quite the tevye of Sholem Aleichem. In producing one of the world's finest musicals, the American Jews who adapted Sholem Aleichem's tevye did more than just to transpose the form of the stories from the printed word to the musical stage and the language from Yiddish to English. They reinterpreted tevye from their own American perspective. Far from underappreciating or undervaluing tevye, they realized that he seemed to embody the spirit of East European Jewry, and they, in turn, wanted to represent the essence of that Jewry as they understood it. And that is the operative phrase here, as they understood it. And in fact, something analogous had happened in the Soviet Union, where Jews of the Moscow Yiddish theater and the emerging film industry of the 1920s adapted other Sholem Aleichem characters in the new Soviet spirit. The figure of Menachem Mendel, as portrayed in the film Jewish Luck, which you can get to see if you want to, was a caricature of capitalism, very different from the original, and different in significant ways. And this is part of a larger problem that a minority faces whenever it tries to introduce its culture into the dominant society. It has to sacrifice something of the particular in order to satisfy the expectations of the general public that it is trying to satisfy. Jews are masters of self-adaptation, and we have an exaggerated need to make ourselves loved. So it stands to reason that in adapting ourselves to the popular medium, we would be tempted to adapt our values as well. So let's see where we stand. We want to commemorate Sholem Aleichem and to acknowledge his ongoing importance and the importance of tevye in particular. And we recognize that in order to do so, we have to separate Sholem Aleichem's tevye from the version created by Joseph Stein, Jerry Bach, and Sheldon Harnick. We separate Sholem Aleichem from his adjusters because, though each is valuable for what each provides, their offerings are not identical. As Sholem Aleichem might have put it, and I can't find the best analogy, he used to say, every carpenter is a man, but not every man is a carpenter. And in the same way, one might say that all of us Jews here in America, all of us Jews here are American, but that's not to say that all Americans are Jews. And here we have to grasp the original tevye, and in order to do so, you have to see some of the distinctions between these two. So, firstly, Sholem Aleichem created the tevye character in 1895 for a Yiddish almanac that was published by his friend Mordechai Spector. In this first appearance of his, tevye tells Mr. Sholem Aleichem how he got the money to set up his family dairy farm that supports his wife and daughters, and the products of which he then delivers to the Jews, non-Jews of the area, including to the author, Sholem Aleichem, who is spending his summer with his family at the dacha, at the country house, away from their residence in Yehupitz. Now, Yehupitz is the fictional stand-in for Kiev, where Sholem Aleichem and his family actually lived. And they actually spent their summers in Boyarka, which appears as Boiberik in this work. In other words, Sholem Aleichem based the Tevye stories on his own experience as the writer who's always looking for material and who happens to find it in this talkative milkman. He enjoyed the Tevye character so much that he brought him back for another 2 episodes in 1899, and again in 1905, in 1906, in 1907, 1909, 1914, and 1916, which is the year that he died. Had Sholem Aleichem lived longer, it's absolutely certain that he would have continued to revive Tevye each time he and the Jews faced a new crisis. Because in each episode, Sholem Aleichem appears as the listener who's presumably transcribing Tevye's narrative in order to publish it. So you see that what's set up here is a commercial transaction between 2 Jews of unequal socioeconomic and cultural status, each of whom is supplying the other with what he needs. The big city author is supporting the country Jew when he buys his dairy merchandise, while the country Jew is supporting Sholem Aleichem when he gives him story material that he can then sell to his market of emerging readers. Now, this is, I think, to me at least, this is the most extraordinary aspect of the Tevye stories. You take these 2 unequal characters, and they are in a commercial transaction with one another that neither of whom could subsist, each of whose economic life depends on the other. And now, of course, none of this is implied in the Fiddler productions, where Tevye speaks outward to an audience and sometimes upward to God. This keeps him at the center of the work as a humorist who makes a little fun of himself, of his neighbors, their way of life, of his relationship with God and the surrounding Gentiles. But it eliminates the fictional structure of 2 Jews talking and the illusion of a national conversation that spans the division between rich and poor, urban and rural, intellectual and folk. And the 1890s were actually years of growing divisions and fragmentation in Russia, when an estimated 40% of Jewish men were said to be Luftmenschen, that is to say, people without any profession or steady source of income. The population was exploding. Anti-Jewish decrees prevented Jews from finding ways of making a living. Hunger was rampant, and poverty, like Tevye's, was driving hundreds into the revolutionary movements and millions to America. This was the time of the largest Jewish migration in history, those years, because of these very conditions. Yet, desperate though he is, Tevye is bothered less by his poverty than by the unfairness, the injustice of his situation, what our political analysts call income inequality. And this is how he prays, actually. He is saying the Shemoneh Esrei, some of you may recognize the phrase from it, and he says, Umekayim emunosoi lishenei ofor, who keepeth faith with them who slumber in earth, With my troubles, I was 6 feet underground already, and to think of those rich Yehupitz Jews sitting all summer long in their resort, eating and drinking and swimming in luxury. Master of the universe, what have I done to deserve all this? Am I or am I not a Jew like any other? So I would say this is real Bernie Sanders territory, right? And the 1890s were the startup years of Jewish socialism in the Russian Empire. Before this, in pre-modern society, all Jews had been subject to the same political conditions. So while there were always disparities of income and influence, Jews were generally subject to a common fate. If there was a ghetto, rich and poor lived within it. If there was an expulsion, all had to leave. The responsibility of community leaders was sometimes so great that they had to be prevented from giving up their wealth and privilege in an attempt to unburden themselves of those obligations. But in the late 19th century, Russia, the Tsar's government, had given wealthy and professional Jews dispensation that allowed them to live in the main cities, Kiev, Moscow, St. Petersburg. Jews who controlled the sugar industry or who were contractors building and servicing the railroads were not subject to the same constraints as the poor people in the Pale of Settlement. The children of rich Jews could bribe their way into the universities, which rejected the majority of Jewish applicants. This drove a wedge into the Jewish community by systematically widening the gap between those who were confined to and those who were liberated from the Pale of Settlement. And this is the premise and the driving problem of most of the Tevye episodes. Now, there is a Yiddish expression, God sends the remedy before the disease. And just so, Sholem Aleichem tried to stave off some of the encroaching damage of this income inequality. In the first Tevye episode, rich and poor Jews support one another despite the obvious and growing socioeconomic disparities between them. And in this first episode, Tevye helps to rescue the women of one of the vacationing Jewish families. They are lost. They just took a walk in the morning and suddenly they got lost in the forest. Tevye finds them. Somehow they ask him, please, help me. And even though he's at the end of a very, very long day's work, quite desperate in his travels home, he turns around the wagon and he brings them back to the dacha where they are reconciled with their family. And this is the excerpt that you have. And I will read just a passage from it to show how this is, I guess, on your handout here, what says page 15, if you have it here. So the rich Jew whose family has been returned to them, it's 2 pages from the end here, page 7 at the bottom, 15 at the top. He says, here is a gift to take home to your wife and children, they said. And now please tell us. They load up his wagon with food, and then they say, the head of the household says, and please tell us how much we owe you for your trouble. To tell you the truth, I said, who am I to tell you what you owe me? You pay me what you think it was worth. What's a few kopecks more or less between us? I'll still be the same Tevye when we're done. No, they say, we want you to tell us, Reb Tevye. You needn't be afraid, we won't chop your head off. Now what, I asked myself. I was really in a pretty pickle. It would be a crime to ask for 1 ruble when they might agree to 2. On the other hand, if I asked for 2, they might think I was mad. 2 rubles for 1 little wagon ride? 3 rubles! The words were out of my mouth before I could stop them. Everyone began to laugh so hard that I could have crawled into a hole in the ground. Please forgive me, I said, if I've said the wrong thing. Even a horse which has 4 legs stumbles now and then, so why not a man with 1 tongue? The laughter grew even louder. I thought they'd all split their sides. Stop laughing now, all of you, ordered the man of the house. He pulled a large wallet from his pocket, and out of it he fished, how much do you think? I swear you'll never guess. A 10-ruble note, all red as fire, as I hope to die. And do you know what else he says to me? This, he says, is from me. Now, children, let's see what each of you can dig out of your pockets. What can I possibly tell you? 5 and 3 and 1 ruble notes flew onto the table. I was shaking so hard that I thought I was going to faint. Well, what are you waiting for, says the man of the house to me. Take your money from the table and have a good trip home. So you see that this is, it's funny, it's meant to be funny. Tevye is much more funny than I'm making out here. But you see that what seems preposterously much to Tevye seems preposterously little to to the children of the family for whom this is mere pocket money. The observant Jewish father understands this, but his children do not, and they laugh at Tevye, whereas he is trying to get everyone to laugh with him. The generation gap is widening, and it is widening the already gaping economic division. Yet, what are we reading? The story of a poor rural Jew who becomes a dairyman thanks to this act of kindness and assistance. And so, what else? A Jew with nothing more than this rudimentary education is so captivating that Sholem Aleichem keeps bringing us more and more of these stand-up routines. And I've called Tevye the first of the Jewish stand-up comedians, because that is, I think, how he figures in this work. So Tevye proves that the culture is strong enough, and through this humor, elastic enough, and through this connection between the Jews still observant enough to compensate for whatever else is pulling us apart. Now, a serious debate had emerged in Zionist circles before Theodor Herzl founded the Zionist movement in 1897 about which should come first: the cultural consolidation of a people that was prepared to reclaim its national sovereignty, or the practical need to settle the land of Israel and provide facts on the ground. 6 years before Sholem Aleichem created the figure of Tevye, the leading proponent of the first of these two positions, Achad Ha'am, which was the pen name of Asher Ginsburg, wrote his famous position paper, Lo Ze Haderech, This is Not the Way, arguing that whereas religion ceased to hold the Jews together, national unity would have to be strengthened by other means, and that this cultural reinforcement would have to take precedence over the political argument that Jews needed a haven of refuge and a place to go. Now, this was a very deep, profound argument. Those who said Herzl was worried about exigency, urgency, and you see that argument repeated later on. They needed a place to go. They needed an escape from anti-Semitism. You needed something. Achad Ha'am said, how this can be. We're not ready for this. You need to consolidate a national understanding, a national Jewish people. Now, Sholem Aleichem was not a political thinker, and certainly not an ideologue, although he wrote a lot about Zionism. Yet he instinctively shared Achad Ha'am's view about the need to forge a strong national culture. He went about it very differently, in Yiddish rather than Hebrew, in fiction rather than political debate. But he did the job in his own way, and in Tevye, you see the ideal of a national culture taking modern shape. Sholem Aleichem may not have done this programmatically. Maybe he wasn't even conscious of what he was doing. But Tevye shows off his wit and humor the way the aspiring Jewish violinists of the day played their instruments. He dazzles us with this folk culture. He impresses us as a father who is struggling to hold together his family that is peeling away. And Tevye, I would argue, is a preparatory step. He's a dairyman. He's a milchiker, right? He is the dairy component for the land of milk and honey, right? So here we come to a second way in which Fiddler on the Roof departs from Sholem Aleichem's intention. When you enter the Broadway theater for this Broadway production, the stage is empty except for a sign in Russian indicating that we are at station Anatevka. As everyone knows, Fiddler is situated in, everybody want to sing? Anatevka, Anatevka, underfed, overworked Anatevka. Where else could Sabbath be so sweet? Anatevka, Anatevka, intimate, obstinate Anatevka, where I know everyone I meet. Soon I'll be a stranger in a strange new place, searching for an old familiar face from Anatevka. I belong in Anatevka, tumble down, workaday Anatevka, dear little village, little town of mine. I love this last line. It is so ingenious. in combining village and town as if the authors were unsure how to translate shtetl. And rather than choose between them, they decided to combine the two. And Fiddler makes much of this shtetl, with its matchmaker, its rabbi, its tailor shop, its Jewish-owned tavern, and so forth. And although Tevye and his family seem to live a little on the outskirts, he is unquestioningly part of the town. One lively scene, if you remember, it shows the spread of gossip, which is always a staple of small-town comedy, suggesting that there are mixed blessings to a collaborative and cohesive community. Here's the thing. Sholem Aleichem's Tevye is not a shtetl Jew. In Sholem Aleichem's day, the shtetl, best translated as the Jewish or largely Jewish market town, was under attack from every direction. Jewish reformers denounced its provincialism, its ignorance, its narrow-mindedness, the hypocritical religious practices. The Marxists condemned the exploitation of women who worked so that men could study Torah, the exploitation of workers by the employers in the local workshops, the exploitation of peasants by the Jewish shopkeepers and tavern owners. They blamed the Jewish tax collectors for the heavy taxes that had to be paid to the Tsar. In a story by Sholem Aleichem's most famous contemporary, the writer Yud Lamed Peretz, which happens to have been published in the same year as the first Tevye episode, the narrator meets a Jewish traveler on the road and asks him, "Where are you from?" And the man answers, "I'm from the dead town," which is also the story's title. Since this is presumably not science fiction, the narrator asks for an explanation. And so he is told about the town's dead economy, the absence of any legal basis, its political dependency, a population that's dispirited to the point of death, all of which makes moral action so impossible that you cannot tell the difference between the living and the dead. On any given day, says the man in the story, you do not know whether your neighbors are living townspeople or the corpses that have risen from the cemetery and have now taken over the town. The story turns the metaphor of a dead town into literal reality. So Tevye is a stunning alternative to the shtetl. As though Sholem Aleichem had set out to clear this archetypal Jew of every taint of shtetl life, he lives out in nature, not even in a village. He's a homesteader among Gentile peasants. He goes to Anatevka only twice a year when he needs a minyan to say Kaddish for his deceased parents. As against the negative image of the Jewish shopkeeper or peddler, Tevye sells only what he himself produces, fresh and nourishing dairy products that have earned a reputation for their quality. As against the accusation that Jewish men cannot protect their women, or that they fail to protect their women, or that they live off the labors of their women. These were all topics throughout the literature of the time. Tevye helps women in distress, and he provides for an all-female family. He is a milchiker, that is to say, a softie, to be sure. And whenever he shows a lot of sentimentality, his phrase is, "Tevye is not a woman." But although this may offend and does offend some modern feminists, it would have been understood to mean that he is fighting against what Otto Weininger and others condemned as the feminization of Jewish manhood. And you know, this was also a widespread trope of the time, that Jewish men are feminized, that they are really female in male form. And Tevye so is an East European Jew, but he is also very much a man, and as my colleague Harvey Mansfield might have said, even a manly man, right? So it does not even take much imagination to transplant Tevye to the colonies of Rishon LeZion, Rosh Pina, and Zichron Yaakov that had recently been established in the land of Israel, because he already has some of the necessary qualities of a rural pioneer. And in fact, When he runs into Sholem Aleichem in the 7th episode, he is about to leave for Eretz Yisrael. At the time that Tevye wrote this episode, he was hoping to get to Palestine. But when he, Sholem Aleichem, had to give up this plan, he added a complication to the Tevye stories that ruins Tevye's plan so that the move never happened. The point here is that while Fiddler presents Tevye as your everyday shtetl inhabitant, he is more like its antithesis. Sholem Aleichem was trying to revise the image of the shtetl to satisfy the new values of economic productivity, religious flexibility, attachment to the land and to nature, and philosophic independence. The authors of Fiddler are reinforcing a stereotype. Sholem Aleichem was working against the grain to create an amalgam of the old new Jew, as in Herzl's Old New Land. Now, what is true for the image of the shtetl is also true for the word tradition. Sheldon Harnick, who wrote the lyrics for Fiddler on the Roof, said that his creators, the creators of Fiddler, found the key to their production with the opening number, tradition, and the introduction of the papa, the mama, the daughters, under the rubric of tradition, invites the Broadway theater goer into a safely distant and presumably simpler time, like that of earlier musicals, Oklahoma or Brigadoon. To reinforce the stereotype, the musical introduces a rabbi, a Sabbath candle lighting, a Jewish wedding, Jewish dancing in what we've come to recognize the Hasidic style. Now this gets Sholem Aleichem's work partially right, since Tevye is obviously an observant Jew who even davens mincha when he is alone in the forest. He is also a father who expects to exercise his authority. But this is also partly wrong. In Sholem Aleichem's original, we never see any Jewish ceremony or holiday, except when the family is eating blintzes on Shavuot, the holiday that marks the giving of the Torah on Sinai, but is here portrayed as an agricultural summer season. There is a local priest in Tevye, but there is no rabbi. For Tevye is his own Rashi, his own interpreter of texts, and much of the fun consists of the way in which he spins the familiar phrases of the Bible and liturgy to his own needs. And I just bring a very short and maybe not even the best, most satisfying example of how Tevye speaks on the last page of that handout. And this is from the story of Hodel, the second daughter, the one who has intellectual aspirations. And he says, and I'll just read from that part at the top, "What you ask, do a book and a dairyman's daughter have in common? Well, I ask them the same riddle. I mean, all those nice Jewish youngsters who, begging your pardon, don't own a pair of breeches for their backsides, yet only want to study all day long. Kulanu chachomim, kulanu nevoinim, as it says in the Haggadah. Nowadays, everyone wants to be a student. Where? How? Why, a cow can sooner jump over the roof than a Jew get into a Russian university. Al tishlach yodcha. They guard their schools from us like a bowl of cream from a cat." Now, this is so, I mean, you see, here I just, there's nobody, you know, you teach Yiddish literature and people sometimes say, do you teach it in the original or do you teach it in translation? Well, to some extent, there's not much difference. Because, yes, you teach it in translation, but Hillel Halkin deliberately left all these quotations in the Hebrew because he said, this is a gift to all the people who know Hebrew. Why should they be penalized? So he keeps it. But you see, this is so complicated that the only people who really can appreciate it today in English as well as in Yiddish are those who know these sources. If you know the original quotation and you know how Tevye is dealing with it, you see, normally you quote and then you comment in order to do what? To clarify or to expound on the quoted passage. Yet Tevye almost always subverts, inverts, or distorts the quoted passage for witty, satiric, ironic, or simply nonsensical effect. So let's take the second of these two things. These two, in this passage, these two youngsters who can't get into the universities really, this is really the revolutionary Perchik and Tevye's daughter, Hodel, who marries him, and at the end of that episode goes off with him to exile in Siberia, to which he has been condemned. Now, so the second of these things, lay not thy hand, al tishlach yodcha, to characterize the punitive Tsarist quota system. Shalom Aleichem and his readers would have recognized this phrase from the very wrenching chapter 22 of Genesis that is read on Rosh Hashanah, the Akedah, the point at which God stops Abraham from sacrificing his son, saying, lay not thy hand upon the lad, neither do thou anything unto him. The Yiddish reads, al tishlach yodcha, a kote fun der puter. This is what the Yiddish is. This expression, a kote fun der puter, a kote is from the French à côté, meaning scat. Scat, it is what you would say to a cat, to get it away from the butter. So you take the phrase from the Akedah, which is like if there is a holy of holies, I think, in the Bible, it is the Akedah. You take this phrase, al tishlach yodcha, and what do you apply it to? Get out of here, says the Tsar. Scram, says the Tsar to these boys who are trying to get into their school. Now, is this tradition? Well, I would say Tevye is traditional the way Jackie Mason is a rabbi. Right? True? True. But he is obviously a comical interpreter of the tradition. So the plot of the Tevye stories follows a liberal conservative father bending to the wishes of his increasingly autonomous daughters. The family is in danger of falling apart, but the two men, locked in conversation, represent a nation that absorbs the shocks of modernity. Despite their different levels of sophistication, the two men presumably worry in the same ways, that socialism comes in the name of idealism and ends by stealing Jewish children away forever from their Jewishness. And on the other side of the political spectrum, that rank materialism, American style, is eclipsing Jewish values and destroying the Jewish community. This is the theme of the 6th and 7th chapters. And if you really have depended on knowing Tevye only through Fiddler on the Roof, I really recommend that you get that book, the title page of which is provided for you, so that you can read the rest of the Tevye stories, because what Shalom Aleichem, carrying forth his theme of worry about the disintegration of the Jewish people, does is to take the theme to the American context and to show the danger, not just from the side of socialism, but from the side of materialism, which is another very great danger. So I would say that these two Jews talking represent an integral people in a disintegrating context. And what do the two Jews worry about most? Well, what they worry about most is the supererogatory universalism. I'm sorry I'm taking so long, but I just introduced this last point with an email that I received this month from a former student who had just seen the latest Broadway production of Fiddler, and he wanted to know what I thought of it. And he writes, I remember your criticisms of Fiddler's portrayal of Aleicham's Tevye, and recently read your critique in Mosaic. I wonder how you react to this production. And he praises certain features of the new production, including the performance of Danny Burstein as the perfect Tevye, and he wants to know whether the superior production may have changed my views. But what he calls my criticisms were in fact a comment not on the production, but on the conception, and to explain, yet again, the episode of the third daughter, Chava, introduces the by now familiar tension between the father who is arranging a suitable match for his daughter and the daughter who is falling in love on her own. In this case, with the Ukrainian, with the intellectually oriented Fiedka. And in order to get married, she goes off to the priest to be converted to Christianity. She wants to remain on good terms with her family, but Tevye sits Shiva, and he forbids mention of her name ever again. Tevye struggles with himself in a conclusion to that chapter that I can never read, no matter how many times I've read it, without tears. But he remains firm. Like a tree that's planted by the waters, he shall not be moved. This was written in 1906. And then there are two other father-daughter episodes. And then Sholem Aleichem doesn't return to the Tevye stories until 1914 and 1916 in episodes that describe how the Jews are being evicted from their towns and villages, and Tevye among them. The refugee exodus concludes the musical just as it concludes the original, of which Sholem Aleichem wrote two versions. Now, Sholem Aleichem personally experienced some of the crises that he ascribes to Tevye, including having to leave Russia and spend the last part of his life as a refugee. He knew how he had wounded his readers because they wrote to him in droves. He wounded his readers by allowing Chava to convert. In 1914, the Tsarist edicts of expulsion and the outbreak of the First World War had brought Jewish fortunes to their lowest ebb, and at this point, Sholem Aleichem feels that he has a chance to repair the damage and to restore the self-confidence of the Jews by bringing Chava back. So Chava leaves her husband Fiedka and returns to emigrate with her family. Tevye is at first reluctant to embrace her. She is dead. But his oldest daughter prevails, and what is left of this family departs together. The Jews are intact. Tevye's parting words to Sholem Aleichem in the text are, "Say hello for me to all our Jews and tell them wherever they are not to worry. The old God of the Jews of Israel still lives. Unser alter Gott lebt." Our old God lives. And the proof of this is that Tevye, the Jew, still lives to affirm him. Fiddler turns this upside down. When Tevye leaves, along with the shtetl, of which he presumably formed a part, Chava shows up with her Christian husband, saying that they cannot stay when the Jews are being forced to leave. Chvedka, now Fiedka, becomes Tevye's moral instructor. And as Tevye refuses to speak to his daughter, the Ukrainian reproaches him and says, "Some drive away with edicts, others with silence." This is, to me, one of the most horrific sentences in modern Jewish culture, because he draws a moral equivalence between the Tsar's expulsion of the Jews and the Jews' intention of remaining a people apart. And he apparently persuades Tevye that Tevye is wrong, so that Tevye gives in, he raises his hand, and he gives them his blessing. The liberal idea of the dissolution of differences, of miscegenation, triumphs over the dream that Sholem Aleichem consigns to Tevye of a people that remains intact as it heads out into the world. So Fiddler comforts us. It comforts us at the end with the message that Judaism is really not such a big deal. So my former student has understood all this, but now he becomes my reality instructor, and this is what he writes me in part of our exchange. He writes me, "Perhaps what was in 1964 when Fiddler premiered is not what is now." He points out that when Fiddler was first staged, audiences might have been satisfied with the ambiguous blessing that Tevye bestows on Chava, God be with you, without speaking to her. He writes, in other words, he didn't totally cut her off, and he still showed some affection toward her. That may have been enough in 1964. Today, intermarriage is a given, and anything but an absolute and full embrace of intermarriage is seen as provincial and intolerant. Tevye's ambiguous acceptance of Chava, mainly the fact that he still cares for her, does not condone or accept her marriage or even leave room for her in the community. This is not enough for the contemporary audience and may not make them feel good as it did 50 years ago. I must point out, my student is not on that side of the argument. He is just pointing out to me that I am so missing the boat here, that what was really, that what was pacifying in 1964 won't even work today. And indeed, the pollsters now tell us that a majority of American Jews think it is racist to oppose intermarriage, right? So they are appalled not by Chava's conversion, but by Tevye's opposition to her free choice of a husband. Anything that satisfies mass entertainment would presumably have to support the expectations that they have of a happy ending. So to come to the end here, Jews have always needed consolation. And the Sabbath of consolation, Shabbos Nachamu, offers follows the annual period of national Jewish mourning. The 3 weeks that culminate in the fast day of Tisha B'Av commemorate the destruction of the temple, the fall of Jerusalem, and the resulting exile. The text for the Sabbath of consolation is the soaring message that Isaiah brings in the name of God. Nachamu, Nachamu Ami, comfort ye my people, saith your God. And these same words, as you know, and I hate to say it, that some of us know it more from another source than from these passages of Isaiah. These same words resonate through the Western world in the most famous of oratorios, the Messiah, which is based on the Christian reading of that same Isaiah chapter 40. Every valley shall be lifted up, and every mountain and hill shall be made low, and the rugged shall be made level, and the rough places a plain, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed. Glory is the operative word. The phrases of Isaiah reverberate in every language, but their function in Jewish theology and Jewish history is clear: to raise our eyes up from the ruins to God's grandeur, to assure us that our people reemerges from its defeats as insistently as grass reemerges from the dead ground every spring. Instead of our destroyers, we are promised God's mastery. Princes will be brought to nothing, for no one is equal to the Lord God who created everything that we see on earth. The majesty of God inspires our hallelujah. The Bible is majestic, a document that's so compelling, with a mission so exceptional that it remains the uplifting force of the Jewish people. But Shalom Aleicham's generation began to experience this differently. When they turned from Isaiah's soaring language, or God's promise to Abraham, to the reality of these little Jews in their little towns, they saw the incongruity between divine promise and troubling reality. Many of Shalom Aleicham's contemporaries, Jews as well as Gentiles, reacted to this divergence by declaring God irrelevant and letting go of religion and faith. When science, as we heard earlier today, when it showed that human beings could figure many things out for themselves, they felt they didn't really need divine guidance any longer and gave up on what they called superstition. Modernity meant, for them, believing in man instead of in God. Rejecting God as the ultimate judge and Lord of the universe, they turned to politics or science as the source of their salvation. Not so Shalom Aleichem. He felt that he was part of this organic people, once enslaved and then liberated from Egypt, that after accepting the Torah at Sinai fought its way to the promised land, from which it was several times forced into exile, all the time remaining true to their teachings and way of life. Shalom Aleichem may have given up on halachic observance, but his faith in the Jewish people grew stronger. Though he could not speak for God with the confidence of Isaiah, he could speak all the more confidently for the Jews who had maintained Jewish civilization. So he provided his contemporaries with a different kind of prophecy and a new source of solace in the steadfastness of Tevye. Sholem Aleichem's Tevye comforts us by his resistance. Fiddler's Tevye comforts us by his acquiescence. Fiddler consigns Tevye to the pastness of the past so that we may celebrate him without reservation because he requires no further assistance from us. Audiences may feel that they have surpassed him in their ability to accept intermarriage with no qualms, no false sense of separation. So sweet, all those things that we dance about. Now Sholem Aleichem's Tevye loses several daughters, his wife, his horse, his homestead, his neighbors, but not a shred of his moral self-confidence. As entertainment, we can admire both, but as Jews, we have to choose between them. So, thank you.